Proper functioning of all body systems requires a balance of fluids and electrolytes. The body works best when these substances are kept within a narrow range of normal. In this lesson, we will be discussing fluid basics. So what do you think about when you assess the client? Think about this during your assessment. The human body is a very complex machine, and machines require many different substances in order to run properly. The human body requires one basic substance that is very simple. This most common substance is water. Water is needed to deliver dissolved nutrients, electrolytes, and other substances to all organs, tissues, and cells. In a healthy adult, the volume of water in the fluid compartments remains within the normal range, although the water moves constantly between these compartments. Proper function of fluid volume requires balance. Fluid balance is essential for cell survival. Fluid balance is closely linked to and affected by electrolyte concentrations. Too much or lack of fluid creates cell apoptosis or cell necrosis. Fluid balance takes power. ATP is needed to generate movement and maintain balance of fluid. Fluid also has a supporting mechanism for all cells. The two main fluid spaces or compartments are extracellular fluid, aka ECF, and intracellular fluid, aka ICF. The extracellular fluid is the fluid outside of the cells and contains about 1/3 of the total body water. The extracellular fluid includes interstitial fluid, known as fluid between cells that's often referred to as third space, which include intravascular, blood and lymph, bone, and connective tissue. Another extracellular fluid component is transcellular fluids known as tissue water. This is located in special body spaces and include the cerebral spinal fluid, the synovial fluid, the peritoneal fluid, and pleural fluid. The intracellular fluid makes up about 40% or 2/3 of body fluids and located inside the cells. So what does water do for our body? Water regulates body temperature, moistens tissues such as those in the mouth, eyes, and nose, protects body organs and tissues, lubricates joints, helps prevent constipation, lessens the burden on the kidneys and liver by flushing out waste products, helps dissolve minerals and other nutrients to make them accessible to the body, and carries nutrients and oxygen to cells. So let's recap the fluid compartments. They consist of the intracellular fluid, fluid within the cells, also known as cytosol, extracellular fluid, fluid found outside the cells, consisting mainly of interstitial fluid, fluid surrounding the cells and plasma, and fluid component of blood. Fluid balance is closely linked to and affected by electrolyte concentrations. Water in all spaces is exchanged continually while maintaining constant fluid volume. Total body water makes up approximately 60% of total body weight in the average adult. 70 to 80% in newborn, 65% in infants, 50% in a child, 55 to 60% in young adults, and 50 to 55% in older adults. A person's age, gender, and amount of fat affect the amount and distribution of body fluids. On page 170 in your textbook, Chart 13-2 provides a detailed chart regarding the impact of age-related changes on fluid balance. As one ages, they experience loss of skin elasticity, decreased muscle mass, adrenal atrophy, and other changes that are listed in the chart. Body fat is essentially free of water, and a person with more body fat will have less total body water than a person who is lean. Fluid intake is regulated by the thirst drive. Fluids enter the body primarily as liquids. Solid foods contain about 85% water, allowing some fluid to enter the body with the consumption of solid foods. The average intake is 1,500 milliliters per day of fluid and an additional 800 milliliters of fluid from food. Fluid loss occurs through several routes. Of all the water loss pathways, the kidney is the most important and the most sensitive. Water loss by the kidney is regulated and is adjustable. The volume of urine excreted daily varies depending on the amount of fluid taken in and the body's need to conserve the fluid. Obligatory urine output is the minimum amount of 400 to 600 milliliters of urine needed to be excreted in a day to prevent toxic waste buildup. If this fails, then waste are retained and can cause lethal electrolyte imbalances, acidosis, and a toxic buildup of nitrogen. The specific gravity of obligatory urine output is 1.032 or greater and is maximally concentrated. Osmolarity is at least 1400 milliosmoles per liter. Specific gravity of dilute urine is 1.005 and osmolarity of 200 milliosmoles per liter. The ability of the kidneys to produce concentrated or dilute urine helps maintain the fluid balance. Other water loss that is uncontrolled is known as insensible water loss. Insensible water loss generally is about 500 to 1,000 milliliters per day or 15 to 20 milliliters per kilogram each day. This loss occurs through the skin, the lungs, and stool. Every degree of an individual's temperature rise, insensible water loss will increase 10%. Loss also increases when the weather is hot and dry. Excessive insensible water loss that is not replaced by fluid leads to hypertonic extracellular fluid and dehydration, which can lead to hypernatremia. Also, diarrhea leads to fluid loss and loss of some electrolytes. Body fluids are constantly filtered and replaced as fluid balance is maintained through intake and output. The total amount of water within each fluid space is stable, but individual water molecules move continuously among all spaces. The three main processes that control normal fluid and electrolyte balance and often work together in the interchanging environments are filtration, diffusion, and osmosis. We will also be discussing lymph fluid. Filtration is the movement of fluid through cell or blood vessel membrane because of hydrostatic pressure differences on both sides of the membrane. Hydrostatic pressure is the constant pressing of water molecules that are in a confined space that are pressing outward against confining walls. Equilibrium is established by the hydrostatic pressure that is the same in the fluid spaces, resulting in no pressure differences. When one space has a greater hydrostatic pressure than the surrounding space, a gradient is recognized. The body then attempts to equalize the two spaces by evening the hydrostatic pressure, resulting in filtration occurring and the movement of fluid permeating the brain. Blood pressure is an example of a hydrostatic filtering force. Diffusion is the free movement of particles across a permeable membrane from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. What does this type of action require? Well, it requires special transport systems, also called membrane pumps. Another term is gatekeepers, to maintain that special cell environment. The sodium-potassium pump is an example of this type of pump that uses energy to move sodium out of the cell and moves potassium back into the cells through facilitated diffusion or facilitated transport. Another example would be the process of insulin and glucose. Osmosis is the movement of water only through a selectively permeable membrane. For osmosis to occur, a membrane must separate two fluid spaces, and one space must have particles that cannot move through this membrane. Because the membrane is impermeable to these particles, they cannot cross the membrane, but the water molecules can. Water will transfer from an area of lower concentration, which has less particles, and greater hydrostatic pressure, into the area of higher concentration that has more particles and a lower hydrostatic pressure to equal out the concentration, thus diluting the particles, promoting concentration equilibrium. So let's discuss osmolarity. This is the number of milliosmoles in a liter of solution. Osmolality is the number of milliosmoles in a kilogram of solution. The normal osmolarity value for plasma and other body fluids range from 270 to 300 milliosmoles per liter. When all body fluids have this particle concentration, the body fluids are isosmotic. IV fluids that are isotonic have an osmolarity of 270 to 300 milliosmoles per liter. Fluids with osmolarities greater than 300 milliosmoles per liter are hyperosmotic or hypertonic. These fluids have a greater osmotic pressure than isosmotic fluids and tend to pull water from the isosmotic fluid space into the hyperosmotic fluid space until an osmotic balance occurs. If a hyperosmotic IV solution, for an example 2% saline, were infused into a patient with a normal extracellular fluid osmolarity, the infusing fluid would make the person's blood hyperosmotic. The body would attempt to maintain homeostasis and would attempt to balance the inequality by pulling interstitial fluid into circulation, attempting to dilute the blood osmolarity back to normal. This results in the interstitial volume shrinking and the plasma volume expanding. Fluids with osmolarities of less than 270 milliosmoles per liter are hypoosmotic or hypotonic. Hypotonic fluids have a lower osmotic pressure than isosmotic fluids, and water is pulled from the hypoosmotic fluid space into the isosmotic fluid space. The thirst mechanism is an example of how osmosis helps maintain homeostasis. The feeling of thirst is caused by the activation of cells in the brain that respond to changes in extracellular fluid osmolarity. In the lymph, a small amount of fluid remaining in the tissues from the capillaries return to the tissues in the capillaries, flows one way, towards the heart. Not all fluid is returned. The fluid that is returned through the circulatory system at the right and left subclavian veins. There is no pump mechanism in this action. Mechanism of action is through muscle contractions, intrathoracic pressure changes during breathing, and peristalsis-like motion in the lymph vessels. Think of a plane ride just gliding through the air. A key factor to remember is the increased risk of lymphedema after a mastectomy. This is an abnormal accumulation of protein fluid in the subcutaneous tissue of the affected limb, a health factor commonly overlooked and requires nurses to educate their patients about this complication. The endocrine system helps control fluid and electrolyte balance. 3 hormones that help control these critical balances are aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, and natriuretic peptide. Let's discuss aldosterone first. Aldosterone is a hormone secreted by the adrenal cortex whenever sodium levels in the extracellular fluid are decreased. It's also responsible to prevent both water and sodium loss. So think about this. You're exercising and you sweat a lot. Your body has a decreased supply of sodium related to the loss through the sweat. The afferent arteriole picks up this decrease in blood sodium levels. The afferent arteriole stimulates the juxtaglomerular complex to secrete renin. Renin acts on the renin substrate, also known as angiotensinogen, converting it to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin converting enzyme then converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 constricts the blood vessels and stimulates aldosterone secretion from the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone triggers the distal tubules, the nephrons, to reabsorb the sodium from the urine back into the blood. Then aldosterone secretion stops when blood osmolarity or serum sodium levels are greater than normal. Next we have antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin, which is produced in the brain and stored in the posterior pituitary gland and controlled by the hypothalamus in response to changes in blood osmolarity. So if we have an increase in sodium or osmolarity, the osmoreceptors triggers cell shrinkage, leading to antidiuretic hormone release, acting directly onto the kidney tubules, increasing permeability to water, leading to an increase in water reabsorption, decreasing osmolarity or sodium. If there is a decrease in osmolarity or decrease in sodium, this leads to the osmoreceptors to swelling, and antidiuretic hormone release is then inhibited directly at the kidney tubules, not increasing the permeability to water, which decreases water reabsorption, leading to an increase in osmolarity or sodium. Then we have natriuretic peptides. These are hormones secreted by special cells that line the atrium ventricles of the heart, aka ANP and BNP. As there is an increase in blood volume and increase in blood pressure, ANP or BNP from the heart is released, binding to receptor sites on nephrons, opposing the renin-angiotensin system, increasing glomerular filtration rate, and decreasing sodium reabsorption, increasing urine output with an increase in sodium content, decreasing circulating volume, and decreasing osmolarity. So remember, the hormonal regulation is triggered by the body's attempt to maintain homeostasis with fluid balance. This concludes this lesson of Back to Fluid Basics. If you have any questions, contact the instructor.